Hi there. My name is Jacob Irwin, and I work at Benefits by Design. I'm pleased to be joined today by Ned Pojskic from Greenshield Canada, who's going to be talking today about biologics and biosimilars, with a focus on the potential savings to drug plans and the benefits of transitioning, as well as the Greenshield Transition Program. We will have a question and answer session at the end of the main presentation, as well as about halfway through to address any questions that come up. At BVD, we believe that there are no silly questions. So if you do have a question, please type it into the GoToWebinar question interface, and we will do our best to address them at the end of the webinar or during the halfway point. This webinar is being recorded. You will receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording after the webinar. If you have any questions or concerns about this webinar, please contact us at socialmedia@bbd.ca. And now I'll introduce our speaker, Ned Pojskic, who is the leader of Pharmacy and Health Provider Relations at Greenshield Canada, or also known as GSC, and we're very pleased to have him here with us. Welcome, Ned.
Thank you, Jacob. Appreciate it. So, very much appreciate the opportunity to be here today and to speak to all of you around some of the work that we've been doing at Greenshield Canada, in particular around biologics and biosimilars. I think all of us, I'm sure, on this webinar are intimately familiar with what's been happening across Canada over the last decade, but perhaps even more so acutely over the last several years around drug costs. And it's certainly no secret that drug costs have been rising at a level that many consider, though not exclusively everybody, but certainly many individuals consider to be an unsustainable from a perspective of future sustainability of drug plans across this country. So today I'm going to walk you through a little bit set the context around what has been happening with a specific subset of drugs called biologics, and some of the natural offsets which have occurred in our healthcare system with the arrival of biosimilars. But I'm also going to paint somewhat maybe of a troubling picture in terms of what has happened when it comes to the uptake of biosimilars, and in particular around what that means for our future ability to be able to sustain our drug plans in the absence of taking advantage of these really logical and essential cost management strategies. So let me begin by setting the context just a little bit. In Canada, we are generally considered to be one of the highest spenders when it comes to biologic drugs in particular. So what you see on the chart on your screen right now is essentially the spending that can be attributed to biologic drugs year over year. And what you'll note, obviously, is a very steep upward curve, which shows that biologics as a general category of drugs are not slowing down anytime soon. This is obviously where a lot of pharmaceutical company investment from a pipeline perspective has been over the last decade, and again, even more so over the last several years. Just to give you a sense of perspective, 2 out of the 3 new products that we review on a monthly basis at Greenshield Canada for inclusion in our formularies can be classified as being in the high-cost category, meaning $10,000 or more per person per year. And a large majority of those high-cost products are in the biologic space specifically. Now, what you also note on the chart, of course, is that Canada is not too far behind when it comes to the United States. It's one of the highest spenders on biologic drugs. Now, that's not necessarily always a bad thing. It means that obviously we're a wealthy country that can spend quite a lot on healthcare, and it certainly devotes a significant proportion of its GDP to healthcare expenditures. What you see on the screen is the share of biologics that are the share of all drug costs that are attributable to biologics specifically. And what you see obviously is that year over year, the share of cost attributable to that biologics category has been growing, now reaching over 21% in 2017 and even higher, slightly higher in 2018. And again, so this is important from the perspective that we understand this is where the pipeline is heading, and the number will continue to grow. Now, what's also interesting is obviously some of the natural offsets, as I mentioned at the beginning, that have occurred. So beginning in late 2014 and early 2015, we saw the arrival of biosimilars on the Canadian market. So let me sort of just walk very briefly through what biosimilars are before we get into the importance of this particular category of drugs. So biosimilars are products which arrive on the market after the patent exclusivity of the original product has expired. So in other words, they're in some ways, and I'm going to purposely use the wrong term here for a second, but just for comparison purposes, they are generic versions of biologic drugs. They're not generics, and that's important to distinguish because they're not generics have a very different types of regulatory pathway and process. They are what we call biosimilars. So they're highly similar to the approved originator biologic product, but not necessarily identical. But what's more important than that, than the chemical structure of any of these particular products, is the fact that they achieve the same or better level of therapeutic outcome than the originator product. The point is, they have to achieve the same level of therapeutic outcome in order to be approved by Health Canada. So those are important key distinguishing features, right? We're talking about products that are chemically, structurally similar, not identical, but achieve the same level of therapeutic outcome. And it's that last point that is by far the most important. Because I've been to probably dozens of conferences over the last couple of years in the Canadian context and internationally as well. And unfortunately, at a lot of these different conferences, you tend to have a discussion around biosimilars. And oftentimes, the biosimilars often portrayed just like what you see on the screen. You have the biosimilar on the left-hand side, the originator on the right-hand side, and they're considered sort of to be like very different. They're both apples, but they're not the same. One is red, one is green, one is bigger. So the notion that is conveyed at a lot of these different conferences is that we must take biosimilars with extreme caution because of the fact that they're not chemically identical in their structure to the originator products. But I personally believe, and in some ways I've been on a quest over the last several years to really start to deconstruct some of these myths, these notions, and things that have been perpetuated, I will say this quite frankly, by vested interested parties for business reasons. Because the simple reality is that when it comes to biosimilars and originator products, they're more like this. In other words, any differences, there are virtually no differences in chemical and molecular structure. And even if there are differences in those structures, it doesn't really matter because the nutritional content is the same, if you will, if we take the food analogy a little bit further. In other words, if the biosimilar or the originator produce the exact same level of therapeutic relief, therapeutic improvement in the human body, then does the molecular structure matter at all? And I think anybody who's ever had the biologic, who's been on a biosimilar version of a product will tell you it really doesn't matter. The point is the same level of therapeutic effect, the same impact, the same relief from your condition, whatever that condition may be. Now, I think that, as I mentioned previously, there has been too much discussion around the chemical structure. And I think that was, as I said, purposely done so to obscure the facts around therapeutic effectiveness. This is a slide that I've used quite a lot to talk to a lot of our clients around the impact of biosimilars, and in particular, their level of safety and efficacy. And I ask our clients to take a look at this chart. I'll orient you to it in a second. So what you see on the left-hand side this is for patients. This is actual clinical trial data. So I'm not pulling these numbers hypothetically. This is from an actual clinical trial of biosimilars and originator products. And what you see is this is specifically data related to patients with rheumatoid arthritis. And ACR, the second column from the left there, is an outcome measure for patients with rheumatoid arthritis. So ACR 20, 50, or 70 simply means whether the patient achieves a 20, 50, or 70% improvement in terms of the number of joints on their body where they're seeing an improvement in therapeutic effectiveness. So obviously, the higher the number, the better, right? In the sense that the greater the percentage joints that you're feeling relief, the better you're feeling. And you see 2 time points, 30 weeks after starting the drug and 54 weeks after starting the drug. And you see 2 products, X and Y. The idea is that, again, compare these 2 products in terms of their therapeutic effectiveness. What you're quickly going to note when I ask our clients is, do you prefer product X or product Y? They're going to say, I don't see any difference. They look identical to me in terms of the percentage of patients achieving that level of therapeutic effect. And that's what the percentages are. The number of patients, the percentage of patients achieving that therapeutic effect. And so when I ask our clients, which product do you prefer, they'll say, okay, they're about the same. I'll pick product X because it looks like just slightly higher by sheer difference, the number is higher. And guess what? That's actually the biosimilar. The originator on the right-hand side, and the originator is on the right-hand side. The point here isn't to say the biosimilar is better or that the originator is better. The point is that they're exactly the same. They achieve the same level of therapeutic effect, and that means they will function the same in the human body. So I present this information because I think it's really essential that we get away from discussions around the glycolation of sugars and complexity of molecules, etc., and get into substance of what really matters, which is what do these drugs actually do? How much do they improve our patients' lives? Now, an obvious benefit of biosimilars, aside from the fact that they achieve the same effect, is that they're also significantly cheaper, and that's important in the space where drug costs are rising exponentially and there is no end in sight, we need to take advantage of these natural offsets which have presented themselves to us. And biosimilars are an absolute example of that. So if you take a look at this table in particular, you'll note the level of savings that can be achieved with biosimilars relative to the originator product. So this is the utmost right column lists the actual difference in price between the originator and biosimilar. So I'm going to point you to the last row in this column, in this table, which shows Remicade and Inflectra. What you're quickly going to see is that Inflectra, the biosimilar version of the product, Remicade, which typically, by the way, is the #1 drug on any plan across this country in terms of utilization and cost, in terms of cost, not utilization, excuse me. What you're going to see from the chart is that the biosimilar version has a 47% discount. That's substantial. This is for a product that can cost anywhere from $15, $20 to $100,000 per patient per year. And in fact, if we take a look at the aggregate sum expenditures on Remicade, in 2017, Remicade had sales of just over $1 billion in Canada alone. So the potential for savings is substantial. 47% discount off $1 billion drug. One drug, $1 billion. There's been very few drugs in history that have ever reached that threshold of $1 billion in sales in Canada, and Remicade was one of them. And that's fantastic. It's an incredible drug. But the point is, we now have a much more cost-effective option for our patients without ever compromising their safety or efficacy. Other biosimilars you see on the list is for also high-volume products like ENBREL, for example, with a 34 to 37% discount. And then we see a couple of others, Lantus, which is a insulin, and a Basaglar biosimilar version of the product, a 25% discount, and Neupogen and Grastafil, which are cancer chemotherapy supportive agents, at 17% discount. So the discounts vary based on various factors, complexity of manufacturing, the entry date of the biosimilar, etc. But nevertheless, I think the picture is quite clear. There are substantial potential for savings here. Now, the other benefits of biosimilars, of course, are not just the immediate price reduction, but it's the fact that it spurs market competition. And as anybody knows who understands markets, we need market competition to drive down prices, because the more competition, the lower the prices. But it's also important from another perspective, and that is access to biological medicines. Because if biosimilars, when biosimilars were first introduced in certain European countries, they were the only treatment options available for a lot of patients, because the originator products were simply too expensive. And patients in a lot of countries, like Poland as an example, never had a biologic available to them. It was only when the biosimilar came that they were able to get access to these products, because they came with a price tag that was finally affordable. And finally, I think it's also an important point to recognize that biosimilars do create an important threshold for new drugs coming to market. Because if you're a manufacturer coming to market with a new drug, you can't just contend with the price of originator products. You have to understand that you're coming in against biosimilar products, which are lower in price. And that lowers that threshold for every new drug coming to market. So a number of different factors here that play a role, which is why biosimilars are so essential. Now, despite this, what I would argue is a no-brainer type of approach of approaching biosimilars and embracing them and ensuring that they do have a key role to play in sustainability. Unfortunately, because of the various activities, some of which, quite frankly, have been nefarious in terms of scaring our physicians, scaring our payers, and scaring the Canadian patient population, some of the fear-mongering and other efforts, unfortunately, because a lot of that kind of effort, this is most people's view of biosimilars today. It's a sense of this journey into the unknown. The idea that we don't know what biosimilars are, they're new, there's something to be feared. And for biosimilars to truly gain the appropriate role they need to have in the marketplace, they're going to have to overcome some fundamental challenges. The first one is a question around adoption, and specifically physician adoption. It is no secret that physicians across this country, at least over the first several years, though attitudes are changing very, very fast over the last year or so as new data comes to market, it is quite clear that most physicians, and particularly specialists, rheumatologists, gastroenterologists, have held traditionally a very strong preference for originator products. In other words, when given a choice between choosing a biosimilar or an originator, they have always gravitated very strongly towards the originator product for a multitude of different reasons, right? And it was interesting because some of the early surveys, and again, I have to also caution that the perceptions have changed as more information has become available, etc. But this is a survey of Canadian rheumatologists from 2015, which indicated a very strong avoidance strategy with biosimilars. In other words, there was a sense that that the rheumatologists would indeed choose to go to a very almost a different product altogether that is a anti-TNF antagonist in order just simply to avoid the biosimilar. And 2/3 of Canadian rheumatologists at the time said that they were unlikely to offer the biosimilar or subsequent entry biologic, as it used to be known by, as initial therapy. So again, lack of information, perhaps, lack of full understanding of biosimilars, but this was the view of many physicians. And while it has changed, there are still important barriers that need to be overcome. We do recognize, however, as with any issue, that as familiarity with a particular product or whatever it may be, as familiarity with it grows, so does acceptance. So the key part of the strategy in ensuring that we do get familiarity is that we do need physicians to prescribe these products. As they start to gain some traction with biosimilars, they see the positive effects that they have on their patients, the acceptance will absolutely grow. And that's what we have seen over the last couple of years. We have seen a growing wave of physicians who are now starting to embrace biosimilars, understanding the impact that they can have on patients and understanding the impact they can have on us as a society from a cost savings perspective. The other question and the other challenge, if you will, though I think in some ways this has been made too much of a red herring, is around interchangeability. So as all of us know, generics are interchangeable with originator products, right? In other words, if you have a mandatory generic plan, when your patient goes to the pharmacist can simply substitute the generic drug for the original brand name drug. That's not the case with biosimilars. You cannot walk up to a pharmacy and have the pharmacist switch you to a biosimilar. They're not interchangeable. And that's a legal designation that starts at the Health Canada level, but it also is important at the provincial level. And the interchangeability then obviously has slowed down, the lack of interchangeability has slowed the adoption of biosimilars, because without the ability to simply put a mandatory generic plan, our patients cannot be switched over to the biosimilar. So it is incumbent, therefore, upon payers to have the necessary strategies to promote adoption of the biosimilars in the absence of being able to rely on the pharmacy community to drive that adoption. And our neighbors down south in the United States have been much more forthcoming when it comes to some of these efforts. In the United States, what you see on your screen is a map which shows all the different states in green that have already put in place the necessary legislation to enable interchangeability of biosimilars once the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, makes them interchangeable. Now, FDA has not yet, to this date, enabled any biosimilars to be interchangeable, but it's coming. And there's every understanding that in the next 2 years, biosimilars will become interchangeable, at least some of them in the United States. And then when that happens, these states in green will have the necessary legislative and regulatory frameworks to be able to take advantage of that interchangeability. And I think we're going to see this in Canada as well over the next several years, but obviously, in the absence of that, we need to think about other strategies outside of interchangeability. And a final issue that biosimilars need to overcome is, quite frankly, around the way that payers themselves have done a very poor job of ensuring the biosimilars have the right place on their formularies. Now, for its part, the public drug plans, the public payers, have been very clear and absolutely supportive of biosimilars. So this is a statement, and it was recently updated just several weeks ago, actually, from the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance, PCPA, which is the negotiating body for drug prices for provincial drug plans. And in their very clear statement, they made it clear that they see biosimilars as one of the keys to ensuring long-term cost reductions and sustainability of public drug programs. So in their mind, and in a very clear fashion, they're stating that biosimilars are going to be something that the provincial drug plans will favor and will absolutely see as a key as a feature of sustainability. And they've paid more than lip service to it, because since biosimilars came to market, the provincial drug plans have embraced them in very specific fashion. So they've put them as the preferred products on their formularies, in some cases delisting the originator product or relegating them to a secondary status only if the biosimilar is not clinically appropriate for the patient. So they've done absolutely what's essential to ensuring that biosimilars are the first-line treatment option and are the preferred products on those formularies. Unfortunately, on the private side, we have not seen the same type of forthcoming approach. What we've seen is a very different type of approach that has embraced deal-making. In other words, deals with originator products that basically do nothing but prop up those originator products on those formularies and continue to give them an outstandingly large 95% market share when biosimilars continue to be relegated to a very, very small market share. So what these deals have effectively done is through non-transparent price discounts, what they've done is essentially ensure that Remicade continues to stay on private drug plan formularies for virtually every other insurance company in this country except for Green Shield Canada. And I'm going to talk to you in a second about why that's essential, why we chose a very different direction than our competitors in this marketplace. Now, so these deals, of course, are non-transparent. So for yourselves and your clients, you're not privy to what those negotiated price discounts are. We are told that the price reductions are on par, if not quote unquote better than what the cost of the biosimilar is. But of course, no one can verify that. And even more importantly, even if that were to be the true, it really doesn't matter. The point ultimately at the end of the day is that why not just take advantage of the biosimilar, and why not support these products which have spent millions of dollars trying to come to market, millions of dollars trying to do clinical trials, trying to do the necessary work to get approved by the regulatory agencies, only to say thank you very much, we're going to take a deal here with the originator. It's not appropriate in our view, and it certainly is not conducive to long-term strong market for biosimilars in this country that ensures that more biosimilars come to market. Because let's be clear, the only reason why these deals exist with originator products is because the biosimilar has come to market. So to not support the biosimilar, it simply does not make sense. Now, from our perspective, in 2016, we announced our biosimilar policy. And effectively what it said was very simple. It's a very simple policy from that perspective. It says that patients who are newly prescribed, so they've never been on biologic therapy before, who are newly prescribed biologic therapy have to start on the biosimilar version of the product. Simple as that. And of course, when this was first introduced, it was seen as extremely controversial. It was like, wow, that's, forcing patients on the biosimilar, etc. And you'd be hard-pressed today, 3 years later, to find anybody in this country, including in many cases the originator manufacturers themselves, to say that there's anything wrong with starting a patient on the biosimilar product. It is a well-understood fact from patient organizations, from payers, from the entire healthcare community, that starting patients on biosimilar is absolutely the right approach and the safe approach. So we were very proud of that policy because it was against the grain, but it was essential for us in sort of ensuring that we take the right approaches and not necessarily take the easy route, right? The easiest route, strike the deal and just simply forget what happens with biosimilars. But despite this particular policy and sort of its essential nature, the only way we're going to sort of assure maximal adoption of biosimilars and maximum savings is, one, if we're all payers are coordinated on this approach, that biosimilars are the first treatment option, and we need to drive the uptake of these products. Now, I'm going to show you a couple of slides just to show you sort of how vastly different we are in this country compared to other countries when it comes to the uptake of biosimilars. So here are some Scandinavian countries and Poland as well, showing in terms of their uptake of infliximab, which is the Remicade product, showing their uptake of the biosimilar version of that product in that country. So what you see is Denmark, Poland, Norway, and Finland are anywhere between 93 and 100% penetration of the biosimilar. And in Canada, at the bottom, we're still at 2.5%. After 3 years after market entry, it is absolutely pitiful that we're still at this stage, and it does not resonate well for us as a country that we're not doing the right things to drive adoption of these products. Now, interestingly enough, the Patented Medicines Price Review Board, PMPRB, which sets the prices for drugs in this country, recently did a report looking at what would happen, what are some of the potential savings we can achieve through biosimilars in the third year, so looking at 3 years after biosimilar comes to market and it has the necessary time to be on the market and grow and awareness to grow, what are the potential savings on the low end and the high end from biosimilar entry? And it looked at these 4 products in particular. So, I mentioned before, the biosimilar for ENBREL, biosimilar for Remicade, for Lantus, and for Neupogen. And what you see is that on the right-hand side, on the high estimate, the high estimate is simply looking at some of the Scandinavian countries and their experience. So what this report showed, that effectively, if we were able to achieve the level of penetration of some European countries, certainly nowhere near 90%, just a very moderate sort of 60 to 70% uptake, we would get savings of $800 million a year in this country on just these 4 products. And of course, because we haven't done that consistently, we're wasting this money. We're throwing it in the garbage. And it's something we really need to change, because ultimately it will come back. It will come back to us, and it will be a question of sort of, can we sustain our plans when we're not doing the right things when it comes to some of these strategies. Now, everything I've talked about to this point has been around what we do with new starts, so patients who are newly prescribed biologic therapy. But the other flip side of the question is Remicade has been on the market for 15 years. What about the patients who have already been on these products for a number of years? Can we safely transition them from that particular originator product over to the biosimilar? And that's really the big question that I think has, in my view, and certainly everywhere I've been the big drug plan question for 2018. And so before I sort of try to get into the substance of answering that around our biosimilar transition program, I'm just going to pause here because that's a lot of information and content, and sort of pass it back to Jacob for to open up to any questions.
Yes, thanks very much, Ned. So we actually do have a few submitted questions here. So anyone who does have a question has not yet submitted it, please feel free to type it into the GoToWebinar platform now. But we are going to get started with a question here, Ned. So this person is wondering, why do specialists and doctors in Canada, or I guess why are specialists and doctors in Canada not so comfortable with prescribing biosimilars compared to Europe? So I think you did touch on this, but if you wanted to expand.
Yeah, and that's a great question. I mean, that's one of the keys to this whole thing. It is ultimately a number of different interconnected factors. So it isn't any one, and I certainly don't want to sort of appear to throw physicians, under the bus on this. It is true for anybody, and us in sort of benefit plans that change is hard, change is difficult, and this does require change. And if you're a physician who has been prescribing these originator products for 15 years, you've seen the miraculous effect it has on your patient, you're kind of loath to change. In your mind, you're say, why bother? If the patient's drug plan is going to pay for the originator, then I'm going to just prescribe the originator, right? I know it, it's worked for me. And while this other product may work just as well, and maybe I've read some literature that it does, if I'm used to this, that's what I'm going to continue to go with. So I think some of it is just that inertia and the fact that you have experience with a product, it works, so stick with it. And again, physicians are patient advocates, right? They advocate for their patients. They want to see them improve. So it's not malicious in any way. It's just simply that part of it. The other part of it is obviously, I guess, a little bit more malicious in attempt in terms of some of the efforts, as I said before, that have been done to miseducate physicians around biosimilars. And that has certainly resonated among some physician communities. And I think some physicians have told me, certainly many conversations, that they're only now waking up from some of the sort of misinformation that has been levied against them and realizing the truth around biosimilars. And I think that awareness needs to continue to grow, and efforts have been made, obviously, by biosimilar manufacturers and others, important patient organizations and others, to try to educate physicians around some of this stuff. So I think all of that will is absolutely gaining traction. We're a very different place today than we were 3 years ago, but some of those factors are the reasons behind the low adoption.
Awesome, thank you. So we do have some more questions, and we do have a little bit of time. I'm thinking, looking to get us back to going to the content at about 2:30, so that's about 2 minutes. So this question, Ned, is how do you account for the difference? Biosimilars do seem more effective. So I think this is in relation to the study percentages that you had indicated at the beginning of the presentation, because it did seem like biosimilars were a little bit higher. So maybe you'd want to comment on that.
Yeah, so and I apologize if I misstated that. So I personally do not believe that biosimilars are better. Like, I think they're identical to the originators in terms of their efficacy and safety. Those numbers that you see, any differences, are simply due to chance in some cases, right? The idea is that if you take 100 patients or 1,000 patients, and by sheer chance, you're going to come up with different numbers. But those differences between the two groups are not statistically significant, right? So when you run statistical analysis, you're going to see that obviously that difference is absolutely, you only can attribute that to chance, not to any real effect. I think, the point I guess I was just trying to make was that they're identical in terms of efficacy and safety. I don't think anybody should make the claim that they're better. There have been isolated cases here and there where some biosimilars actually have certain slightly better safety profiles in some cases, and some of that is interesting, right? From a perspective that maybe perhaps over time biosimilars are coming to market after seeing the experience of the originator, and manufacturing processes have certainly improved over the years. So you could attribute some of that to that, but I think at the end of the day, the important point is to simply conclude that they're identical in terms of efficacy and safety, and significantly cheaper in cost.
Awesome. So I think we can squeeze perhaps one more question in there before we get back to the rest of the content, because I know we do have a lot to cover with the biosimilar transition program. But there's one thing I just want to clarify. So there does seem to be a little bit of confusion between the difference between biologics and biosimilars. So if you wanted to comment on that, it does to me sound like they are the same, like one and the same, or are able to do the same thing. But if you wanted to just expand a little bit on the definition of biologics versus biosimilars and the differences, if any, between them.
Yeah, no, so just to clarify, right, when we talk about biologics and biosimilars, we're talking about both biologics and biosimilars are both biologics. They're all biologic drugs. It's just that the originator, what we call originator, were manufactured by one manufacturer. So let's focus on Remicade for a second. They were made by Janssen, or Johnson & Johnson, as they're known internationally. And then the biosimilars made by Pfizer. So it's simply different manufacturers that are making the drug. And after the originator has lost patent exclusivity, after the 15 years or the time period after they lose exclusivity and they lose their patent, then anybody can make a copy, if you will, of that product. And that's what biosimilar is. It is a new version, if you will, of a biologic drug that, again, has to be submitted to Health Canada, has to do brand new clinical trials, right? Has to do brand new clinical trials to show that they're just as safe and effective as the originator product. And then they get licensed to be sold in this country, right? So again, just to be clear, the point I'm making here is that the biosimilars are simply made by different manufacturers, right? But they're identical in terms of their safety and efficacy, and nearly identical in terms of their molecular structure.
Perfect. So thank you for doubling down on the clarity there. That's great. So we are going to get right back into the biosimilar transition program. So we're aiming for about 20 to 25 more minutes, and then we'll have our final Q&A session. So I will let it get back to you, Ned. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, Jacob. So moving on now to talk a little bit around the biosimilar transition program. So I ended off my previous section by saying that everything I had said up to that point was around what happens with patients who are newly prescribed biologic therapy. The biosimilar transition program that GSC introduced in March of this year addresses the other side of the equation. What do you do with the patients who have already been on the biologic drug, originator biologic drug, for a number of years? And so the biosimilar transition program was introduced earlier this year for that particular situation. And it is for plan members who are currently stable on Remicade and ENBREL for 3 specific indications: rheumatoid arthritis, ankylosing spondylitis, and psoriatic arthritis. So patients who are taking either Remicade or ENBREL for one of those 3 conditions are the ones who are eligible to be transitioned from the originator product to the biosimilar version of the product. And the way we do it is that we basically, I'll talk through the process because it is quite extensive, but what's important here is that we're continuing to allow patients choice, but we're applying biosimilar pricing for those plan members who qualify. So in other words, after a certain period of time, when the patient is transitioned, the claims cut down to the cost of the biosimilar. So in the case of Inflectra, the biosimilar for Remicade is 47% of the cost of the originator product. Now, in structuring this particular program, we had to work very closely with the patient community, and we had to work very closely with the physician community as well. And so we partnered with an organization called Arthritis Consumer Experts. And this is one of the leading patient organizations in the arthritis space specifically. They're a national organization. They have a medical and scientific advisory board composed of patients and physicians and scientists who do work in the space. And what they did was basically we worked with them to structure our criteria for transition process. So the idea here was to work with patients directly with a very knowledgeable, informed patient organization to help us structure what should this program look like. What should the criteria be for transitioning patients? How should we communicate this to patients? And how should we work with them through this process? Who should be exempt from the process? And who is not a candidate for transitioning? All those important safety considerations that were part of this in working jointly with ACE. Now, the other partner we had, and this is our preferred pharmacy network partner, Health Forward. And so we work with them very closely to structure a dedicated team of nurse care coordinators who are there to basically help answer any questions that our plan members may have as they go through this important process of transitioning. So we recognize that as patients are asked to transition, that this isn't as simple as simply sending them off and saying, go get a new script. You have to provide a strong infrastructure and support and network for these patients to ask questions, to help them assist with getting a new prescription, to work with their doctor. And this is what this dedicated team of nurse care coordinators is all about. And they're available for our plan members to ask any questions in all of those aspects. So just give you an example schematically how this works. So I want to start off with a very clear premise that this program is optional. So it is at no point have we made this program mandatory for our plan sponsors. What we've done is simply roll it out and allowed our plan sponsors to choose whether they want to be a part of it, whether that meets their plan philosophy, whether that meets the needs of whatever they're facing currently in terms of their drug costs. So we start with the plan sponsors, and if the plan sponsors opt in, then we identify the plan members who are taking these two drugs. We then send these plan members a transition letter, which tells them all about the situation, the safety and efficacy of biosimilars. We present all the necessary information as structured, importantly, for us by a patient organization. The letter then is sent to the patient, of course, and they have 60 days to choose whether to remain on the originator product and have their claim reduced down to the cost of the biosimilar, or to actually transition to the biosimilar, in which case then they can contact Health Forward, work with our coordinators to help them with the entire process of transitioning to the biosimilar. After 60 days, we cut down the claims to the cost of the biosimilar. And again, the process is very extensive, and we try to really think through every possible touch point and every potential issue the patient may encounter, such that we're addressing it right up front, rather than having a call come into our call center or whatever the case may be. Now, from the perspective of Health Canada, it's important to recognize that Health Canada has very clearly stated that biosimilar transitioning is something that they're absolutely okay with. They recognize the importance of well-controlled transitions, and only for those indications where the drug is approved. And of course, that's what we're following in this program. So that's an important starting point. We're simply not offside in any way, shape, or form when it comes to Health Canada. The other important point here is when we look at international payers. So in May 2017, the European Medicines Agency published a paper which basically summarized their collective experience with biosimilars across 11 years. And what's important to recognize is that when we talk about biosimilars, we think about them as being new. They're absolutely new in the Canadian context, right? But they were not new in Europe. In fact, they've had 11 years of experience of biosimilars in Europe. And this story has very much played out in Europe over a number of years. So for us to sort of say that this is new and we need to be cautious is absolutely erroneous. We can simply draw on the European experience, over a decade of that experience. And this paper really summarized what they found, which is they've had 11 years, they've had 28 different biosimilars that have been approved in these jurisdictions, and they've had 0 safety concerns. And I'm not paraphrasing, this is their actual headline from this paper. They wanted to make sure that it was absolutely clear and on record that biosimilars are safe and that there is no questions around their safety and efficacy, and they collectively summarized that experience in this paper. Now, the other aspect, of course, is that not only are biosimilars safe in European experience, but they've also been, patients have also been successfully transitioned in many European countries from the originator to the biosimilar. Thousands of patients, and in particular inflammatory arthritis patients, have gone through this process with absolutely no compromise in safety or quality of care. And the evidence from Europe and other jurisdictions has mounted very, very quickly around biosimilar transitioning. So if we go back to 2006, which is only about 3 years ago, or under 3 years ago, actually closer to 2 years ago, we've only had about 4 switch studies, 4 studies in which the safety and efficacy of switching was tested. By June 2017, we had 53. And in fact, I just checked more recently, just as of several weeks ago, we've had 101 studies, individual studies that have been done on biosimilar transitioning. 101 individual studies through which patients have been transitioned, and each of which has shown the biosimilar safety and efficacy switching to be safe. And of course, as you can see on the left on the x-axis, as the evidence mounts, so that the confidence in terms of transitioning. In order for us to conclusively be able to make the understanding that biosimilar transitioning is safe, we need a robust body of evidence from 2 sources. We need clinical trials, because they're well controlled and they're well designed to study whether something is safe and efficacious in a very controlled setting. But we also need real-world experience because we recognize that clinical trials, as great as they are not the whole answer to the question. People do funny things in the real world. They don't take their drugs. They split their doses. They miss things. They do things they're not supposed to. And as a result, the efficacy and safety of things can look very different in the real world than it does in a very controlled clinical trial. So we need evidence from both buckets in order to conclude that transitioning is safe. And fortunately, we have evidence from both of those. So if we look at patients, again, with inflammatory arthritis, specifically, who have been successfully transitioned, we can see over 75 different studies in that space. One of the leading ones in this space is one called NORSWITCH. This was a very interesting study, and it was the first randomized controlled trial to assess the efficacy and safety of transitioning in patients. Why this study was very important was that it was actually done and conducted and funded by the government of Norway. And why that's important, of course, is that it's free of any pharma influence. This is a country that has had biosimilar transitioning for a number of years. And somebody actually asked the question, well, you've been doing this, but is it a safe thing to do? So the government of Norway commissioned the study, did it independently, and funded it independently. And they included patients with all kinds of disease states. It was in 40 different centers throughout Norway. And they had 481 patients who either stayed on the originator product, and then they followed them to see what happens to them, or they transitioned to the biologic product and followed them and see what happens to them. And this is what they found. At the end of the study, this was concluded in 2017, they reported the following chart. What you see is that across all of those patients, in the numbers in the columns, and please focus on the very first row, where it says all patients, because the numbers are quite small when it comes to individual disease states. What you see here is the number of patients and the percentage of patients whose disease worsened, right? So on the originator column, this is patients who stayed on the originator, so they never switched. And biosimilar column is patients who switched from the originator to the biosimilar. And so if you look at the proportion of patients whose disease worsened, right, you see that there's virtually no difference between those who stayed on the originator and those who switched to the biosimilar. And the authors of this study concluded that biosimilar switching was safe. So you see a slight difference of 4.4% between those two groups, but anything under 15% is considered to be the non-inferiority margin was set at 15%. So anything less than that means there's absolutely no difference between these two groups. And that was the conclusion of the study. What they said is that they see no differences in disease worsening between those who stayed and those who transitioned, and the results were seen for all kinds of endpoints, immunogenicity and safety. Similar type of evidence is available for the other major product in this category, ENBREL. So this is another transition study done specifically for ENBREL, patients across a number of different disease states, 245 patients in particular, who either stayed on the originator or transition, and they were assessed up to 100 weeks. So they followed these patients for quite a while just to see what happens, right? And again, this is the conclusion, and I'm not paraphrasing. This is an actual conclusion from the study. Efficacy, safety, and immunogenicity were comparable between the two groups, showing no risk associated with transitioning patients from the originator ENBREL to the biosimilar version of the product. So again, absolutely strong conclusion. One thing I just want to sort of point out here, and you'll see the word immunogenicity mentioned in this particular conclusion. So immunogenicity is a concept whereby patients sometimes, when they're on a biologic drug, over time, their body starts to recognize the drug as a foreign body. It's as if you inserted a new organ into your body, right? Because biologic drugs are living cells by the nature. So when you introduce it in the human body, the human body may detect it as foreign and attack it, thereby rendering the drug ineffective. And this is what typically happens with a lot of patients on biologic therapy. They say all of a sudden the drug stopped working. And that's because your body figured it out and realized it isn't part of your body, it's a foreign body, and therefore it neutralized it. So there's always been a concern that if you switch to the biosimilar version of the product, that this immunogenicity, this immune response might be heightened. And as a result, you're going to have a faster, this concept that your drug will stop working for you even sooner. And of course, none of that has been shown in any of these trials, and so we can really put that particular risk to rest. I mentioned a couple of minutes ago that there are in order for us to conclude that the safety of transitioning can in fact be concluded, we need the clinical trials, which I just spoke to you about, but you also need real-world evidence. And so the real-world evidence is also available through multiple patient registries across multiple European jurisdictions. So one in particular in Denmark called DanBio is an example with 802 patients who stayed on the originator product, and over 1,500 patients who were transitioned to the biosimilar version of that product. And so this is something that was mandated by the government of Denmark in 2015. And so what they did was they actually put these patients in a registry and they tracked them to see what happens in the real world for these people. They were not randomized. There was no controlled trial. It was simply following them in their natural setting. And the results of this showed very nearly identical results to the trial data. And this is what they concluded. They say the collective evidence shows little to no clinical difference in efficacy, safety, and immunogenicity between biosimilars and their biologic originators, and no risk associated with transitioning patients. So again, we're seeing this time and again, the same conclusion come out regardless of the type of trial design. So again, for plan sponsors who are considering adopting this particular program, and again, I want to be clear that when we launched this, we started with 3 large clients in March 2016. Those clients were part of our initial pilot for this program, and the pilot has been more than successful. We've seen a number of our patients transition. We've seen some patients who have stayed on the originator product. They chose to stay on the originator product after working through with their family physician, with their specialist physician. And, regardless of their choice, we're seeing these patients absolutely no compromise in their safety and efficacy. And ultimately, the plan sponsors are reaping some significant savings through adopting this particular program. And that's really the key, variable here, is that you're not compromising patient safety, but you're significantly enhancing the cost effectiveness of your program. The other important point here that is often not well recognized and not mentioned is the fact that there is also better coordination with provincial drug plans. So I want to sort of paint one important picture. Take a look at what happens in the province of BC. The province of BC no longer pays for Remicade. So if you're a plan sponsor who is with another carrier other than GSC, and you're paying for Remicade, you're assuming the whole cost of Remicade because you cannot coordinate with the provincial drug plan. And we know the provincial drug plan in BC pays for 70% of all drug costs in that province. So if you're now a plan sponsor, you're assuming 70% more cost for these drugs than you should because your patients should be coordinating with the provincial drug plan. And they cannot when you have these deals because you're paying for Remicade and the province does not. So it's essential that we get better coordinated with what provinces are doing, and the only way to do that is to embrace biosimilar transitioning and embrace the biologic policy. I already mentioned this uninterrupted plan member access, and again, opportunity for our clients to opt into this program later this year. So our pilot phase is now nearly ended. It's about 95% completed, and we are going to be opening up this program to all of our clients beginning in December of this year to put on their plans and achieve these savings associated with these drugs. Now, so I think I've kind of beaten this to death, quite frankly, around evidence, but I just find it to be so essential because no matter where I go, and I've been, multiple conferences, events, etc. The number one thing I hear from people, and people who, quite frankly, have not often read the evidence, have not taken the time, but they've heard somewhere this line, and this is the line I hear: there's not enough evidence. So I'm going to just sort of one more time forcefully make this point. I apologize ahead of time for being forceful. What you're going to see is a series of slides, and in each of these slides, you're going to see in one line is one study. And you're going to see on one of the right-hand columns the number of patients in that study. And so across different pages, you're going to see the number of studies that have been done, and the number of patients in these studies on biosimilar transitioning. Each and every one of these studies, and I know this because we've actually pulled each and every one of them, has concluded that biosimilar transitioning is safe. So I'm going to show you these slides just for the sake of providing the breadth of evidence. So take a look at the amount of evidence. I'm going to just count the slides. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. 11 pages of slides. Over 90 studies in those slides. We're actually over 101 today. Over 14,000 patients. 7 different drugs and 14 different disease states have been tested in these trials. So if this isn't enough evidence, then I really don't know what is. Because when I go back to my my desk and I'm asked to review a new drug coming to market and asked to make a decision around that new drug, it typically lands on my desk with maybe 2 studies, maybe up to 4 studies if the drug is really great and they did a lot of trials. And I'll see maybe somewhere between 100 and 500 patients being tested in these trials. And so we're asked to make decisions on brand new drugs. We're asked to put them on our formularies with that level of evidence. And yet, with 14,000 patients in 90 studies, we're still questioning the amount of evidence. So evidence apparently isn't all equal depending on where it comes from and depending on if it meets our preconceived notions around what, and quite frankly, what our business demands and needs are. So I just want to dispute the notion there's not enough evidence because I think there's more than enough, and I think it's important to recognize that. That's really it, all I really wanted to say. I am open to any and all questions on this topic. Obviously, as you can imagine, we're very passionate around this, and we think that there's absolutely, this is one of the keys as we go forward and look at sustainability of drug plans. This will be key part of the equation. Thank you for your time and attention.
Okay, thanks very much, Ned. That's awesome. So just to remind everyone, before we jump into the question and answer portion of the webinar here, that this webinar is being recorded and that the recording will be sent to you in our follow-up email. So as we go through the questions that have already been submitted, please feel free to continue submitting your questions through the GoToWebinar question interface if anything else comes up or something occurs to you. But we're going to get started. Let me pull one up here. Okay, so this person, Ned, is wondering what happens if the transition to a biosimilar is unsuccessful or ineffective? Can the patient return to the originator biologic at full coverage?
Yeah, so that's a great question. We are, I think, sometimes when you talk about policies, we talk about them in a rather general sense as if they're hard and fast. The reality is when we go through the biosimilar transition program, we recognize that during that process, we will identify things for certain patients that may make them, let's say, not great candidates for transitioning. I'll give you an example. If we have a patient that has rheumatoid arthritis, but they're also facing cancer, that's not a patient we're going to be transitioning, quite frankly. And we're going to exclude them from the program right up front. And we're going to, their doctors will appeal, give us that information, and we'll absolutely exclude them immediately from the program. But it's also true for other situations. The important point is to recognize these patients right up front, right? Because there's no logical reason why a patient who is an originator, if the originator works for them, there's absolutely no logical reason why the biosimilar won't work for them. Nobody's ever in this world showed that to be the case. So the idea that then if they transition and it doesn't work for them, then I'm 100% certain, and every piece of clinical evidence indicates this, that the originator won't work for them either. What that means is that that patient is reaching the end of life for that particular therapy. In other words, they're in a situation where that particular, let's say it's infliximab or ETANERCEPT, they've reached a point where that drug will simply stop working for them for a multitude of different reasons. So as a result, they're going to need to go to a different drug altogether. So instead of Remicade, they may need to go to Humira or ENBREL or whatever the case may be. And it has really nothing to do with a switch, and it simply has to do with the fact that at the end of it. End of therapy for them, right? So again, it's really important to sort of recognize that and know that right up front. Of course, every situation is different, and we fully understand that that may be a situation where, for whatever reason, the physician can create a clinical scenario for us and indicate to us through prior authorization why the biosimilar did not work for them. We'll absolutely allow them back on the originator. But again, I want to sort of be very clear that we've now gone through the transition program. We've had over 50 patients who have now switched, and never has that come up, and we don't expect that to come up, but we do recognize that every clinical scenario is different, and we will absolutely treat it as such. And if the physician creates a clinical rationale why they need to go back, we'll allow them back for sure.
Awesome, perfect. So I have a number of questions here that are all kind of asking the same thing. So I'm just going to kind of amalgamate them, I suppose, into one here. So basically, I've got quite a few people who are wondering, since the biosimilar transition program has been initiated, what the uptake is. So how many people, have agreed to transition from the originator to the biosimilar?
Right. So we've opened it up initially to so a select group of clients who expressed interest in our various venues and embracing this. So we didn't roll it out widely in the initial phase of the pilot. And this isn't because we weren't sure that it would be safe or effective, but more just to make sure that we get our processes correct and that we have everything worked out perfectly before we launch it on a book-wide basis. And of course, that's what we've done through the pilot. So we've had 3 very large clients who have joined this, combined with who have hundreds of thousands of lives covered, and they've had roughly 50, 60 patients now who have gone through the transition program. Of course, once the client opts in, it's mandatory for the patient, right? So it's not, the patient doesn't have a choice to say, oh, I don't want to do that, forget it, right? Once the client says that they want this for their plan members, then we roll it out, of course, to all their plan members who are on these drugs. We have had off the chart sort of demands in the meantime from our clients who are asking when can they opt in. So we really do expect the floodgates to open come December of this year when we open the program to all clients. There's going to be an initial wave of, I think, a significant number of plan sponsors who are typically on that more progressive end of the stream who move fast with some of these things. Then I do expect that across 2019 we're going to continue to see a steady flow of clients adopting the program. And I do fully expect that at some point in the next several years, we will have full penetration of this program across most, if not all, of our clients. Ultimately, again, all at their discretion of whether they adopt it. But we certainly have seen that with a lot of our other products. For example, our specialty drug PPN, which has over 95% penetration now, or some of our other products that quickly reach that level of adoption as time goes on, as they see the value of these programs.
Awesome. And I'm going to jump in here and ask a question of actually my own. It was something that you just said. Can you just maybe expand on, maybe I misheard you, whether or not, so this the biosimilar transition program will be opening up to kind of all Green Shield plan members in December?
That's correct. That's right. We're opening it up to all plan sponsors in December. We're going to have some communications coming a little bit later in November and late fall around just the intricacies and details of this. But at that time, we will announce the availability of this program to all our clients as of December of this year.
Oh, awesome. Okay, perfect. So I do have a few more questions here. Is the patient's own prescribing physician involved in the transition to a biosimilar program decision, and what level of involvement do they have, if so?
Right. So it is absolutely essential that the physician be involved, and all of our communications, as structured by our patient organization, were very much looping in the family, not the family physician, the specialist, because it's typically the specialist that prescribes these drugs. So rheumatologist in this case. Our direction to our patients is to have a dialogue with their family physician, their rheumatologist, because this is a dialogue that does need to occur, and they need to sort of there needs to be a monitoring in place to ensure that once the transition does occur, that they're being monitored appropriately. So that's the direction to our patients, and they obviously go to have that dialogue directly with their physician, and we've seen lots of feedback that has occurred and occurs consistently with no issues. And of course, our nurse care coordinators are there to help facilitate that as well, right? Should there be any questions, should there be any need for staff facilitation, that is important. Of course, the rheumatologist physician involvement is essential because there does need to be a new script generated, right? Because the patient is obviously prescribed an originator product and they need a new prescription now for the biosimilar. So their involvement is absolutely essential. Now, we have seen through a small minority of cases, or maybe not small, particularly for the ENBREL, where some of the patients reach out to their patient assistance program, in which case then they work with the patient assistance program to cover the cost difference. And then they stay on the originator product, but the patient assistance program covers the difference in cost, and therefore they're not out of pocket anymore. So we have seen about a quarter of our patients who have chosen that route and have chosen to work with their patient assistance program to stay on the originator without paying any difference.
Okay. Can you talk about what the typical client reaction is to the biosimilar policy or to the biosimilar transition program?
So, I think, a lot of our clients have generally been very positive about this, from the perspective of embracing the gist and understanding of the policy. I don't think that all of our clients are ready, quite frankly, to go in this direction, and certainly some who are in the unionized environment are having some early dialogues with their unions around this, because there's a sense that that's something that either may have to be negotiated or something that may simply, depending on the relationship with the union, could be implemented without a specific negotiating item. So our unionized clients are having those dialogues right now, and I think we're supporting them in that process through presentations to union or discussions or whatever the case may be. Generally speaking, again, it's been overwhelming demand and off the charts sort of positive reaction to this. And as I said, I think I do expect a number of these clients to start to adopt this come this late fall and early next year, as it evolves. Lots of questions, of course, about the process, all those things, and we're obviously working through all of that with our clients and making sure that they're fully informed around what they're embracing.
Awesome. So we are at 3:01. We did go over a little bit, but that is okay. So I'd like to thank you, Ned Pojskic from Greenshield Canada, for coming in and talking to us and our advisors about biologics and biosimilars. So people on the line can look forward to a copy of the webinar, as well as a short survey being emailed out to them in our follow-up email. Thank you again for joining us here today, and please enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody.